Okay guys, so as you can see, I got my hands on the Curado MGL 150 way sooner than expected. This is the middle of August and I was really expecting these reels not to come out until the middle of December. So that goes to show you that the expected arrival dates on Tackle Warehouse can change at a moment's notice. Now as you can see, the box here is like a matte soft satiny finish versus the shiny gloss boxes of the other Curados, and it's kind of like a dark forest green. So I think the reel itself is supposed to be that color as well, and this reel I guess is supposed to fill in the gap between the best-selling Curado 200K and the Power Finesse Curado MGL 70. So potentially this MGL 150 could be the best performing Curado of all time, at least in theory. Alright, so paperwork and oil, of course. So I'm gonna put the box off to the side. Now this reel is distinct in the fact that it's not supposed to share platforms with any other Curado. So it's got an all new frame and body. And check this thing out. You can definitely see that green on the side plates. Now I'm looking at it through my camera LCD screen and I'm trying to judge the size, but it feels kind of medium sized, I guess you would say. They went with the chrome end caps, which is good. You can see they ditched the gold or yellow accents on the spool tension. They went back with the flat thumb bar. With its high position. But I'm gonna rotate this thing around quite a few times so you guys can take a good look at it. Made in Malaysia, no big surprise there. There's that MGL spool. Now surprisingly, the reel came shipped with the drag backed all the way off, which is kind of strange for Shimano. If you've owned as many Shimanos as I have, you know they usually come with the drag tightened. Okay, so far a good looking reel, not as small as I thought it would be, but of course we're going to be doing some size comparisons and I'm going to be looking at this reel with my own bare eyes instead of through the camera LCD screen. But yeah, I'm going to do my customary inspection, take notes on everything that I see of note, and I will get back to you guys. Okay, so my inspection is over, and I'll have to say that while I knew that before iCast that Shimano was going to be coming out with a Curado 150 with more than likely an MGL spool, I thought they would take the lazy way about it and just take the existing 200K and slap in the JDM Scorpion MGL spool, maybe make a few tweaks here and there, change the color, and call it a day. But that's not the case, because this new Curado MGL 150 is a whole new reel that doesn't share any platform with any current Shimano baitcaster. Now you can see this is probably the pointiest Curado yet. It's got a really pointy nose and pointy thumb bar, and you can see that they raised, I guess, the top frame here a little bit higher, and it's a nice comfortable place for your thumb to rest. Now this reel is two-tone. I don't know if you guys can tell, but the frame itself is matte satin black, while the side plates are this green color, and you can really see the green here on this new Curado versus the other Curados, which people claim are green as well. Now the front nose piece is black as well, but this part right here is aluminum, while everything else is graphite. And the frame is pretty small, which I'm thinking they did to reduce weight. And as I stated earlier, I'm so glad they went with the asymmetrical flat thumb bar instead of the thumb bar that was on the 200K. Now it is still high, which is good. Now it is kind of small. There's not a lot of real estate on this thumb bar, but you can see they did put some grooves into it for grip, and the center section is kind of like a soft touch coating or material for grip. But it does feel good. No wiggle, no slop, no mush. Now you can see, unlike the 200K, they went with the exposed screw design. You can see the screw here and here. But other than that, it looks pretty clean and very distinctive. Now one great thing about this new Curado is that while the SVS Infinity dial is in the same place, they did raise it slightly away from the side plate just a little. I don't know if you guys could tell, and it makes it a lot easier to turn with your finger. Now if you watched my Curado 200K video, you'll know that I complained that the SVS Infinity dial on that reel is recessed too far into the side plate, making it hard to turn, and it was screwed in too tight to begin with. But I'm happy to report that, at least on my reel, the dial is raised enough for you to be able to turn it pretty easily just by reaching your finger down and doing this. And I don't have to loosen the screw in there. The tension on this dial is just right. Now one interesting note I will say is that when I took a look at the dial, Shimano had it set on 4 from the factory. Now once again, the drag star, just like I predicted, is made of graphite, which they painted silver to try to fool you. And of course it does click, and of course the spool tension does not click, but it's got the MGL logo engraved on it. And of course they went with the silver color instead of the yellowish gold on some of the other Curado reels. So it's similar to the MGL 70 in that respect. But everything else you can look up online as far as specs go, bearing count, etc, etc. But once again, this is supposed to be the lightest Curado to date at 6.5 ounces, which we'll test on the scale a little bit later. But I did mount this reel on a rod, and it feels very comfortable. And with that being said, let's get to some size comparisons. Okay, so I'm really only going to compare this new MGL 150 to 3 reels, and the first one is going to be the 200K. Now remember when I said that I really couldn't tell how big or how small this reel was when I took it out of the box, and I felt it was more medium sized? When you look at it compared to the 200K, they are about the same size as far as the frame goes. It looks like the 150 is a little bit wider, and maybe the 200K may be a little bit longer. That could be just a trick of the nose sticking out a little bit farther on the 200K. So from the top they look to be about the same, but when you flip them off to the side, this is where you see the big difference between the two. Now from this angle, you'll see that the 150 is noticeably lower than the 200K, and more importantly, the side plate is not nearly as big and doesn't hang down as low as the side plate on the 200K. So while the frames may seem very similar in size from the top, when you palm this reel, it palms much smaller. And that's something that I criticized about the 200K frames, is that they made the side plates way too big and they made it drop down way too low. So while the reel itself is pretty small, when you palm it, it actually feels bigger than it really is. So next up, we're going to compare it to the MGL 70. And you can see it is a noticeably bigger reel than the 70, which is not a surprise, since the MGL 70 is probably the smallest reel in Shimano's lineup. Now when you flip them off to the side though, they look to be about the same height, and even though the 150 side plate looks to be bigger, it hangs off the side probably just as low as the 70. So feeling these reels in hand, they feel very similar, but the 70 in my opinion still palms smaller. And I think that's due to the fact that the frame is a smaller frame. Okay, so the last reel I'm going to compare sizes with is going to be probably its main competitor. That is the DAIWA TATULA SV103, the new 2020 model. And they look pretty similar, but the Curado is a little bit smaller. Now they are different shapes. The Curado is wider at the back and tapers off to the front, while the TATULA is wider at the front and tapers off at the back. But yeah, the TATULA is a bigger reel, but they're about the same. Well, maybe the Curado does palm a little lower. You can see it is lower than the TATULA, probably by a millimeter or two. But yeah, they palm a little bit different in feel, and due to the fact that the frame of the Curado narrows off towards the front, it palms smaller in my opinion. And once again, I'm comparing these two because they are equal in price at $199. So of course that makes them natural competition for each other. So yeah, the new Curado MGL 150 has about the same frame size as the 200K, but it is lower, and more importantly, the side plate is smaller, so it palms a lot smaller than 200K. Okay, so as you can see, I have the scale out, and we're going to see if this is truly the lightest Curado ever, as Shimano claims. But first, we're going to weigh the other Curados. Now here's the 200K, coming in at a hefty 7.72 ounces. Yep. Now here's the 70 MGL, which gained weight from the previous model at 6.9 ounces, so almost 7 ounces. Now here is the TATULA SV 103 2020 model, 6.63. Now here's another reel, which is the previous generation Curado 70, which I believe weighed about 6.5 ounces. Oh, actually 6.62 ounces. So Shimano might be right if this Curado MGL 150 actually weighs 6.5 ounces. Now this is the XG ratio 8.1 to 1, and it does sport a longer 96mm handle than the other ratios. So this actually may not weigh that 6.5. Feels a little heavy, but let's see. 6.66. I don't like that number. So let's try to get another weight on it. Up, 6.66. So I'm pretty sure that the lower gear ratios, like the 6 and the 7, with their shorter 90mm handles, will hit that 6.5 ounce mark. But it's virtually tied with the previous Curado 70 for being the lightest Curado. So of course, next up, more importantly, we're going to get a weight on the spool. But before we do that, we're going to take a look at a change that Shimano implemented in this new Curado. And as you can see right there, the SVS Infinity for this new Curado has 6 arms instead of 4. And I'm also glad that the side plate is attached and spring-loaded. But yeah, let's take a look at this closer. Wow, getting this spool out is tough. What is blocking it? Okay, so it looks like the side plate has to be at a certain angle in order to pull this spool out. But here we go. 6-arm SVS Infinity. And let me see how many brakes they have activated. Alright, as you can see, they have 3 brakes on and 3 brakes off from the factory. And once again, the external dial for the fine tuning was set to 4. So kind of like a mid-range setting there. Alright, let's take a look at this spool. Now, this is a 32mm spool, so it is smaller than the spool of 200K, but it's the same diameter as the spool of the 70 MGL. And you can see they put a rubber O-ring at the end of the spool shaft there. I guess this is their way of giving this reel silent tune, but it's got no spool bearing. It feels pretty light. Now I'm going to make a prediction here. I predict that this spool is going to be lighter than the 200K, of course, but it's probably not going to be as light as the 70 MGL. Now if I remember, the 70 MGL spool weighed like 12.7 grams, while the 200K spool weighs right in at 16 grams. I'm thinking this spool is probably going to weigh somewhere in the 14 gram range, but there's only one way to find out. Alright, moment of truth. I have my special scale that I bought just for weighing spools, and I have 5 spools out on the table. Now when it comes to pure MGL reels, the way that Shimano usually has it is that the more expensive the reel, the lighter the spool will be. So for example, since the BANTAM MGL costs more than the CHRONARCH MGL, it has a slightly lighter spool. And since the METANIUM MGL costs more than the BANTAM MGL, its spool is even lighter. And since the ANTARES costs more than the METANIUM, its spool is even lighter still. Now the only outlier to that is the ALDEBARAN MGL, which has the lightest spool out of all of them. But it was created for finesse. Now Shimano kind of upset that order last year with the introduction of the Curado 70 MGL, which has a lighter spool than the more expensive CHRONARCH and BANTAM, but I don't think that they made the new MGL 150 spool as light as that. I predict it's going to be somewhere in the 14 gram range, but let's find out if I'm right or wrong. Alright, so let's turn this scale on, and we're going to start off with this green spool, which is the Curado 200. And yep, 15.983, so pretty much 16 grams. Now here's the spool of the 70 MGL. Now this is the same diameter, but I think that it is slightly thinner than the 150, and I'm correct on that. I think it's about maybe a millimeter or two thinner, but let's refresh our memories and see what this spool weighs. 12.71. So yeah, very, very light. Almost as light as the METANIUM spool. Alright, so here is the spool of the TATULA SV 103 2020 model. I think this weighs like 13 grams. Yep, 13.15. And this spool you see right here is the spool of the JDM Scorpion MGL 150. And I believe this is like 14.1 grams. Somewhere in that vicinity. Yeah, 14.16. So I'll be surprised if the new Curado MGL 150 spool is lighter than that Scorpion. In fact, holding it in hand, after handling that Scorpion spool does feel heavier, but let's see what the scale says. Oh damn, 12.8? So pretty much 12.9 grams. Let's weigh that again. Yeah, so this is a huge surprise, because I swear this Scorpion spool feels lighter than this Curado spool. So this new spool is literally only almost 0.2 of a gram heavier than the MGL 70. So that's a big surprise, and a very pleasant surprise in my book. So this reel should be able to handle light baits very easily. Now let's go ahead and compare the sizes. Now once again, the new MGL 150 is sporting a 32mm spool, and you can see the size difference there. Now the depth is slightly shallower than the 200, and here it is compared to the JDM Scorpion. The JDM Scorpion spool is shallower, but it is wider. Yep, so the spool width on the Scorpion and the Curado 200K is 25mm. I'm thinking this new MGL 150 probably has a 23mm width spool, and let's confirm that by comparing the height with the 70, which has a 22mm spool. Yeah, you can see that it is slightly wider than the MGL 70. So this is 23mm wide by 32mm in diameter. But you can see that the MGL 150 is about twice as deep as the spool on the 70. So man, that is awesome. I thought that Shimano would probably reduce the weight of this spool by maybe a gram and a half, give us something like a 14.5 gram spool, but 12.88 grams, that is huge. So this thing should be a dynamic caster, and maybe the reason why they opted to go with the 6-arm SVS Infinity for more control, because in some of these SVS Infinity reels you are on the verge of being underbraked sometimes. Now before we wrap this video up and I give you my final thoughts on this awesome new Curado, I'm going to take a minute to just go over some of the, I guess, standard features and Shimano marketing on this reel. Now obviously it's going to have the X-Ship double bearing pinion support. Now the MGL spool is S3D, which means it has uniform thickness throughout the spool. Now this is the first Shimano spool that has silent tune but doesn't have a spool bearing. As you can see, it had that rubber O-ring on the end of the spool shaft there. And this features a cross carbon drag, which gives you 13 pounds of stopping power. So incidentally, that's higher than the 200K and higher than the 70. Now obviously it's going to also feature your micro module gears, and the reel is very smooth, but doesn't feel as smooth as my 200K, which feels super buttery smooth, and it feels like the gears may need a little bit more grease. But according to Shimano, the gears are made of brass, not aluminum, which is very surprising since they achieve this low weight with this reel, because usually when manufacturers want to save weight, the first thing they do is swap out brass gears for aluminum. And one last thing, I want to correct myself in saying that on Shimano America's website they say that this reel has CI4 plus something. Now I don't think it's the side plates, I think it's the drag star. So it's not just a graphite drag star, it's CI4 plus, which is lighter and stronger than graphite. So I will admit that I've been really pleasantly surprised with the new MGL 150 and its specs. And the best way to sum this reel up is like this. The new MGL 50 has the strengths of both the 200K and the 70, but at the same time eliminates both of their weaknesses. Now with the 200K, this is an awesome performing reel for average to heavy lures, but it will struggle with lures that weigh under 1/4 of an ounce compared to some of its competition, because the spool is pretty heavy and it holds so much line. And this is also a reel that I would not use for certain techniques, let's say like a walking topwater lure or a jerkbait, because the reel is so heavy and it palms bigger than its small frame would suggest. Now with the MGL 150, Shimano has eliminated those problems by giving this reel a smaller, much lighter MGL spool that holds a little bit less line, so it should handle lures under 1/4 of an ounce with no problem easily. But of course we're gonna put that to the test. And they've also knocked off over an ounce of weight and also given it a lower profile and much smaller palming ergonomics than the 200K. So this is definitely a reel that I could see myself using for walking topwater lures as well as jerkbaits, or any technique that requires me to snap my wrist, because it's so light and comfortable to palm. Now with the 70, this reel was made for lighter lures or shorter presentations like pitching and flipping with normal to heavier lures. So that means it's got a very shallow, very lightweight MGL spool. But the problem with this reel is that it is very small and comfortable to palm, and this is a reel that I could see myself using for walking topwaters and jerkbaits. But since the spool is so shallow on this reel, you're really limited to smaller topwaters and jerkbaits, because if you went with a heavier jerkbait or topwater that required heavier line, you could literally cast all the line off of this spool. So it's kind of like a two-trick pony. Now with the 150, we saw that the spool in this reel is just as light as the spool in the 70, but you can see it holds much more line, therefore allowing this reel to be able to handle bigger and heavier lures that require, long casts. And since the spool is so light, on paper it should handle lighter lures almost as good as the 70, and probably you only really see a separation between the two when you're getting into bait finesse weights. And don't forget, this reel is actually almost half an ounce lighter than even the 70. Now when you couple that with the fact that the reel has more drag stopping power than either of these two, then you kind of wonder who's going to want to buy the 200 or the 70 over the 150, especially given the fact that the 70 costs $30 more than this 150, and the 150 costs only $20 more than the 70, but gives you much more versatility and way better palming ergonomics as well as a lighter weight. Now of course, on paper numbers are one thing, but real world casting once again is another. So of course we're going to take out this new 150, cast it around, see what it's about, see if that new 6-arm SBS Infinity system will give it better versatility. And then of course after that, I'm going to take all 3 of these reels out on the casting field, and we're going to have a measured cast battle with heavier and lighter casting plugs, and we're going to see what's what. Alright guys, thanks a lot.